Misha here, and when I do historical videos, aircraft, or sometimes tanks, they do get more views on this channel. And in the distant past, I covered naval ships. But we haven't really touched on them in a long time. Part of it is there just aren't that many die-cast naval vessels made. And scale. It's difficult. A lot of them are 1/1200, 1/1250. These on the table are 1/1100. That and 1/1000 I kind of feel like are the best, because once you go to 1/700 or 1/350, things get big real fast, and then you can't have a fleet. And that's actually why I'm doing this video today. I finally completed my fleet. Years ago, the brand Eaglemoss, yeah, not just Star Trek, they did all kinds of other things long before, did a series of 80 plus, there's actually a few more than 80 officially, die-cast, mostly World War II era ships, some World War I, and mostly of the Imperial Japanese Navy, although they would throw in a token American, German, British, what have you, even 3 French from time to time. But when they did this series, they pretty much got all of the warships, at least major ones, in World War II of the IJN. And for years, I picked these up, kind of mostly finishing my collection during COVID, like a lot of us. But I had one missing Japanese carrier. One. And I just recently found it by complete accident. Zuikaku. This was the last and most modern fleet carrier at Pearl Harbor, and one of the last major carriers to survive into 1944, so towards the end of World War II. Pretty cool, pretty important. And now that I have all 6 fleet carriers that were used at Pearl Harbor, and 4 of these would be at Midway, I thought we'd look at the fleet carriers in part 1. Part 2 will be later war carriers like Toho. And in part 3, we're going to look at some odd ducks, some conversions and oddballs. And yeah, we're going to get to the I-400. Why wouldn't we? It's really cool. But this will mostly be about, in this little 3-part series, and I will probably do a supercut too, the Eaglemoss 1/1100 scale diecast, and they're pretty good at being diecast. The hull is diecast, the flight deck and all that are plastic. And they're really fun, and for a long time you could pick these up really cheap, but lordy, I looked at prices on eBay, and they are no longer really cheap, so I'm glad I picked them up when I did. And actually, one of these is not technically Eaglemoss. It's actually even a rarer brand, but it's the same mold, just on a different stand. And we'll talk about what happened there, because it involves a lost package and a really cool seller years back on eBay. But yeah, these are from, well, a few different periods. The ones on the top row are all 1942, so Midway era. But on the bottom, we have 1932, so pretty early on, 1938, when this first launched, and 1941, when this first launched. So we're going to talk about these. Technically, they're all unique vessels, but loosely part of 3 classes, although you could argue Akagi and Kaga being different classes. So yeah, if you enjoy this, please comment and share with friends, because these take a lot of effort. But I love doing it, and it's raining today. And again, if you like it, we'll look at some of the fleet carriers done after these, because there were a couple more. And we'll look at light carriers, conversions, tenders, and a aircraft cruiser. With that, let's just dive in and go back to where it kind of all starts with the naval treaties of the 1920s and 30, and Japan's kind of changing position and all that fun tonnage stuff. We're actually going to begin with Japan's third carrier in service, Kaga, and its second fleet carrier, with the first being Akagi. And it's simply because this version is, again, 1941, 1942 refit. And this version here is the original as launched, 1932, and Akagi would be very similar to Kaga here. And neither of these started off as aircraft carriers. Although, World War I, Japan was on the side of the Allies with, U.S., Britain, France, and so they thought that they kind of deserved the same treatment. This is where the seeds of a lot of hard feelings and misunderstanding kind of begin, amongst other things. But they had this plan after World War I, the 8x8. They wanted 8 new battleships, 8 new battle cruisers. And they would actually begin laying down 2 and 2 ships, 2 cruisers, in 1920. But 1922, Japan does sign the Washington Naval Treaty, which had several restrictions on overall tonnage and the number of ships. And Japan is not given the same grace and exceptions as Britain and the USA. Now, all are having to sign, all are having to generally stick by the terms, but, the major powers kind of carve out for themselves some exceptions, and it allows some existing things to go on, and, and so on and so forth. Japan thinks they deserve the same treatment, whereas the US and Britain see Japan as a regional power at best. Japan sees themselves as a growing global power. Either way, this is the genesis of their 2 carriers. Now, they had laid down, technically, the world's first purpose-built aircraft carrier. Before that, carriers had been conversions and whatnot, the Hosho. And we'll talk about it in a later video, but it was always kind of a light carrier with 12, 15 planes on board, depending on the era, and rarely would see frontline combat, although it would see some. What they would do here, though, the Washington Naval Treaty allowed for the conversion of 2 battleships, 2 battle cruisers into aircraft carriers, and of course there's a tonnage limit there too. And since Japan had already laid down 2 vessels, they're going to convert them. For the battleships, you have the Tosho class, 2 would be laid down, and for the battle cruisers, you would have the Amagi class. And basically the difference is speed. Cruisers, less armor, more speed. Both would have 10 large guns, yada yada. But they will pick 2 for conversion. In the beginning, it's actually going to be the 2 Amagis, Amagi and Akagi. They're going to convert those. Cool. Tosho and her sister ship Akaga here. Akaga is named after a province in Japan. They don't know what to do with them. They're already pretty well underway. Technically, Kaga here was laid down in the summer of 1920. She's kind of taken out of dry dock and launched in November of 1921. And in 1923, they got to figure out what to do. Also in 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake. That severely damages Amagi, and they can no longer use her as a conversion. This is where Kaga comes in. Now, Akagi over here is still able to be converted. We'll get there. But Kaga is now the Tozo ship, going from a battleship to a carrier. Fleet carrier at that, a large one. Hosho was quite small at well under 10,000 tons. And we're not going to get into long tons, short tons, metric tons. In fact, in this video, I'm going to do some rounding of dates, generalizations, and get some things wrong because I want to get through this in at least a reasonably timely manner. So they decide to convert both. So let's put a pin at Akagi and talk about Kaga here specifically. Throughout 1924, they don't really do anything with the incomplete warship. They make plans. They kind of see how the conversion of Akagi is going. 1925, they begin essentially construction once more and conversion from battleship to aircraft carrier. And by 1928, this is done. She's ready to go. She begins sea trials, and by 1929, she's commissioned in the I believe it's the First Fleet, and begins operations. And there are some relics of her being a battleship. She's relatively slow, especially in the skies, at about 27.5 knots. And she does have a little more armor going on. And ironically, early on, she actually still retains a few surface guns. They didn't know what carriers were going to be up to. Hosho had given them a little bit of an idea, but it was a much different type of carrier. Akagi and Kaga were really where they were going to cut their teeth. Keep in mind, too, the U.S. converted battleships, battlecruisers themselves. You have things like the Saratoga, the Lexington, for another video. And naval doctrine and aircraft are very different at this time, too. And you notice that she kind of has a cake top situation, not to mention dust. I should have dusted these off beforehand. Sorry. But she has 3 flight decks, although they're pretty short. Our top deck is a little under 550 feet by 100 feet. And then we have a very short middle deck, which is under 50 feet. There. And then we have a slightly longer lower flight deck at just over 180 feet, and it does narrow. 2 out of these 3 actually open onto hangars, and then there's a third hangar below. We originally have 2 elevators, no catapult system. We have kind of a arrestor system inspired by European designs at the time. And you notice they're not really doing much in the way of islands here. It's kind of a Japanese thing at this point. And they do have a little bit of light anti-aircraft, I think 6 batteries. Nothing much going on there because different times, what have you. Her original flight group had 28 bombers, torpedo bombers as it happens at this point, 16 fighters, and 16 reconnaissance aircraft. What were they? They were Mitsubishis and Nagasaki's. They were like the A1N and the original B1, M3, things like that. Early little biplanes. So that kind of tells you. So she's not all that fast. She's got biplanes, but she's still one of the biggest, most modern carriers. At this point, her tonnage is around 35,000 with an overall length of over 800 meters and a crew of around 1,350, 1,400, depending on which exact mission. These things fluctuate, what have you. And they're starting to work out their doctrine for carriers at this time, but they're still a long ways off. But they have 2 now, so they can send Akagi in, do things with her, do Kaga, whatever, switch them out, or maybe work together. They're going to get there. By 1931, she's considered fully ready to go. And at the beginning of 1932, she's sent over to support Japanese operations in China. This is really when that war is heating up, 32, 33. And by February, her air group actually gets its first kill. It was actually an American volunteer pilot. And back and forth, back and forth. Eventually, because they don't really use air cover properly, they will lose some of their torpedo bombers. Dive bombers are still a little ways off at this point, but they're working. They're getting things hammered out. And I should also just mention that in 1930, they would also sign the London Naval Treaty, which had further restrictions and exceptions and so on and so forth. But they send her home after that first couple of months of operating in China, really kind of cutting their teeth. And they need to do it. A newer aircraft, this is an era when we're almost to that point when aviation is really, really starting to pick up speed with modernization. And Japan is kind of at the forefront of this whole carrier thing, and part of it is the restrictions of the Washington and London treaties. Kind of puts them in this position where battleships, battle cruisers aren't practical, although Yamato exists, and they're going to go this direction. But 1933, they're going to send her in for a refit and a modernization. And this will last, begins in late 33, lasts till mid 35, give or take. And then she begins to look like Akagi over there. They will extend the top flight deck, kind of plate over the lower two, fill them in. Originally, her flight group was 60 aircraft, as we talked about. It'll bump up her air group to 72 now. Plus, eventually she can stow up to 18 spares, i.e. disassembled planes. So they're not ready to go, but they're there for a total of 90. This will also up her tonnage quite a bit to about 38, nearly 39,000. It'll up her crew to about 1,700. She'll get more anti-aircraft installations, and this will change a lot throughout time. I'm not going to stop and talk about every time they add new aircraft guns or new radars as they come into use in this video. More importantly, she gets more fuel tankage, and her top speed is upped to about 28 3/4 knots. Part of it is new boilers, new pipes, new funnels, and just kind of reworking everything to make her more effective. And so she'll come out of dock in 35 with the new refit, and she'll be put into combat by 1937, fighting over in China as things really are heating up there, having some wins, some losses. And even though she'll launch with newer aircraft in 1935, already by 1937, she's getting yet a newer air group with planes we might actually start to recognize by this point. So that's the original kind of early abridged history of Kaga here, and I'm really mentioning it because she's in this neat configuration, and it's definitely, well, yeah, unique. But by this point, she looks much more like her half-sister ship here. Akagi, essentially the command ship of the Kai Butai, very famous, Japan's second carrier, first fleet carrier. And no, this is not actually an Eaglemoss model. It's still 1/1100 scale. It's actually a KB brand, which I don't think they lasted very long. It uses the same tooling, but it's actually on a larger base with that cover. And the reason I got it was the original Akagi that the seller sent me disappeared. It never did show up here, back there. And, bless him, not only did he send a replacement, he actually essentially sent it almost overnight with DHL. I think it took like 3 days to get here. And he didn't have an Eaglemoss. He said, "Is this okay?" And I said, "Sure, fine. If anything, I think the cover is a bonus in the larger stand. In fact, I kind of wish all the large fleet carriers would be like this, and I think the quality is absolutely identical." Anywho, there we go. And it's very similar, even though it started off as the Amagi battle cruiser versus the Tozo battle ship. The big difference was mostly armor and speed. And this was actually originally laid down as that cruiser at the end of 1920, when the Washington Treaty was signed in February of 22. Construction was essentially halted. Then the Great Kanto earthquake, September of 23. By that November, this was picked along with its sister ship. Originally was going to be the conversion. Then, of course, like I just said, Kaga would take Amagi's place, and they would be underway. And this would be the first one to get the aircraft carrier treatment, underway in 1925. First, kind of being launched and commissioned as a carrier, and then fully in service by late 1927. Shakedown complete towards the end of that year, and by 28. It started fleet exercises, training, and what have you, originally looking like Kaga. It did have a slightly longer top flight deck, about 625 feet versus about 550, which is actually why Kaga was converted first. Plus, they found out the kind of funnel system, boiler system, exhaust system on Akagi worked better, so they put it on Kaga. I should also mention that Admiral Yamamoto actually commanded this ship briefly, 28 to 29. That's kind of cool. And after her initial shakedown cruise and testing, she would go in for a minor refit in 1931-32. This is actually why Kaga was sent over to support Japanese operations in China. And then once Kaga would go in for her refit, this was the main lead aircraft carrier in the fleet. And her conversion would begin in 1935, later on that year. And it wouldn't actually end until October of 1938, even though it was simpler. They just extended the flight deck. They didn't have to redo the funnel system and all that much. It was a budget. It was a funding problem. By this point, they're working on Yamato and all that. Yeah, so it takes a little longer to get done, even though the work's simpler. And very similar results. Now, interestingly, whereas Kaga actually gained speed, this lost it because both of them gained tonnage. This one went up to 38,000 tons. Standard, it could go over 40, really fully laden. But originally, it had a top speed of about 32 and a half knots. It would dip down to 31 and a half knots after the refit, getting it pretty close in line with what Kaga could do, which is generally a good thing. They were kind of aiming for at least 30 across the whole group. Didn't quite hit that, but close enough. Flight group's about the same. It actually held just a little bit fewer planes in some ways. Had a flight group of around 61, but with 25 spares, so less active, but actually more spares, more or less bringing them equal. And when it was ready to go, it would have regular torpedo bombers, actually quite a few of them, 34 plus like 16 spares or nearly. But then they would have dive bombers for the first time on board here. I believe the first was 16, 15. And most importantly, probably the first recognizable plane it would have a dozen A5M Claudes by 1938, plus a handful of spares. So that was its kind of flight group. It would continuously get more anti-aircraft defense, 6 single mounts, 6 dual mounts, different sizes, 14 other dual mounts, ranging in size from like 20 centimeters to whatever have you, doesn't matter. They would keep adding on. They would also give it a tower on the flight deck. It's interesting because it's on the port side. And it too would have 3 elevators, all that good, happy stuff. It would also get a new arrestor system developed in Japan. They've been playing around with that for quite a while. And again, it was the kind of lead vessel, although when it was in dock or not available, Kaga would take over. They would switch in and out. But by this point, they're kind of working on a doctrine of grouping aircraft carriers together to support each other. Originally, they were kind of meant to attack enemy battleships. Still can do that, of course. Pearl Harbor is coming. But they're starting to really get more flexible, especially with dive bombers. You don't see near as many reconnaissance aircraft on board now. A lot of aircraft are starting to kind of do double duty. We'll see that with upcoming ones. And finally, the biplane is starting to disappear in favor of, metal-skinned monoplanes. But it's still a little ways off. After she's back from refit, she'll go over in 1939 to support Japanese operations in China. No surprise there. Operate there for a few months, and then later that year go back to Japan for kind of a minor work and training. And in 1940, things are starting to kind of come together for Japan, and they're having really true purpose-built carriers. Just a little bit of comparison. On the top, we have the KB/Eaglemoss 1/1100 scale Akagi. And below, we have the D'Agostini. There's been a few other brand names use this as well. The 1 1250 scale. Both die cast, but you can really see the difference in just that little bit 150 makes. It does kind of show you the elevator in the middle of the flight deck. Japan wasn't the only one to use that, but yeah, you can see where that would be problematic, all things considered. Little aircraft on here. It's not a bad model, especially because these are pretty inexpensive, but name, well, like I said, Kaga. It's a province in Japan. Akagi, it's actually a mountain that means Red Castle too. And again, these names were actually assigned when they were battleship and battle cruiser, respectively. With that, let's move on to this fine warship here, dated 1938. Soryu, or Soryu, I've heard it pronounced both ways. Either way, meaning a dragon that is as blue as the deep sea, also just translated as blue dragon or green dragon sometimes. And yes, I know that the one tower is kind of laid over. That's just how it came in, and I haven't figured out a good way to fix it yet, so leave it alone. We'll call it battle damage. Anyway, this is as she appeared during her first mission in 1938. So she still has biplanes on board, although not that many and for not that very long. And this carrier is very important because, well, it was laid down, planned for as a carrier. Now, Japan had other purpose-built carriers like Hosho, but those are relatively small carriers. This one was planned on as a fleet carrier. She'll actually have a very similar sized air group to Kaga and Akagi and Kaga, but she is smaller because when she was planned for in 1931-32, they were still adhering to the Washington-London treaties, so they were trying to kind of keep size tonnage to a certain point. On paper, she was about 16,000 tons. In reality, it was closer to 19,000, but they were always playing fast and loose. Overall length was about 711 feet. Overall meters about 227. So almost as long as the other ones, but where she really saves is width. Just under 70 feet at the kind of water line, or not counting the flight deck. That does blow out to about 85 feet at the flight deck's widest point, but still more narrow than the previous ones. And speaking of speed, she was pretty fast. Yeah, she was laid down by 1935 and under construction, and in 37 she was launched and commissioned at the end of that year. And during her sea trials, she set a record for the fastest aircraft carrier in the world at 34.5 knots. Now, real speed and, you know, laden down with aircraft and all that, it would shrink down some, but still she could hit 34 knots. Not bad at all. Now, she did feature an island. It's on the starboard side. She had the new arrestor gear system. She had around half a dozen twin, essentially 50 cal, so half-inch, mounts, 12.5 millimeter, and she had 14 dual inch, so not 25 millimeter anti-aircraft mounts, no surface guns, that kind of thing. Still designed to be light. She had 2 hangar decks, but the kind of cake tier system, that's long gone by this point. And in a lot of ways, she and her sister ship, which were planned for at the same time, although some argue they maybe not be the same class, some say they might be, you can decide, were really among the most advanced warships in the world, aircraft carriers in the world, when they were first commissioned. I should also point out that even though she was designed and constructed under the London Treaty, by the time she was actually commissioned into the Japanese fleet, Japan had renounced everything. In 1936, they just pretty much said nuts and walked out of the London Naval Treaty. And, Pearl Harbor was wrong, all that good stuff. But I have to admit, Japan wasn't treated as fair as maybe they should have been way back in 1920-22 with the Washington Treaty. It wasn't like Germany, which was considered the aggressor. They were on the winning side, so I do kind of get where they're coming from. On the other hand, what's going on in China, that's no good. And that's really where she first sees combat. She's sent over to support operations there in the summer, running through September of 38. She launches with around 9 of the older A-1N fighter aircraft, and she has some bombers, torpedo bombers on board. She does have some of the newer dive bombers like the B-4Y, but actually these get detached to support operations further inland in China. Yeah, her original flight group is quite small, although she was able to support over 60 aircraft thanks to, modernizations, newer planes, and what have you. So she'll cut her teeth in 1938 in the Chinese area. 39, she's sent back to home waters for training and, just to kind of see how she worked after her shakedown. And this is, an all-new design and entering the fleet. Now, I should say that pretty much all future standard fleet carriers in Japan kind of owe themselves to Soryu here. She really kind of laid down a pattern. But she was the first, so that's good in some ways. On the other hand, they found some areas that she could be improved with. Therefore, her sister ship, Hiryu, was, more like a half-sister, because design changes and improvements were made, including to that island. Hiryu, or Hiryu if you prefer that way. Flying Dragon, one of the most appropriately named aircraft carriers, and I do really enjoy the Japanese, and the Chinese do it too. Very poetic naming of even kind of crude steel war vessels. Is she a sister ship to Soryu? I think so, or at least half-sister. But she was laid down right as they were getting out of the London Treaty, and they were starting to learn things, especially like the 4th Fleet Incident in 34. So her design was modified from the get-go, whereas Soryu was around 16,000 tons on paper, really about 19 in reality. She was about 17 on paper and nearly 20,000 and a half in reality. She's the same overall length. Actually, she's just a tiny hair shorter at about 227.4 long versus 227.5, so about 745 feet, give or take, on each. But whereas Soryu is under 70 feet at the beam and about 85 at the widest point of the flight deck, she's about 73 feet by about 88 feet on the flight deck. And the flight deck herself is still 711 feet long, so just a little bit wider. She also holds just a handful of aircraft more, about 64 on paper versus around 61 for Soryu, not counting disassembled. And she would launch with not just the 25mm AA guns and the dual mounts. She would end up with triple mounts, and she would have 40mm AA guns. She also had her island moved to the port side, so really only one of two? Kind of an odd decision. Still had 3 elevators, 1 central in the front, but then 2 starboard in the back, and 2 hangars, what have you. And she was nearly as fast, and really when commissioned they were equal, but in testing 34 knots, so just slightly slower than Soryu, probably because she was just a little bit wider, a little bit heavier. They also would use a lot of the same like turbine parts and things as the Mogami class cruiser, Mogami if you prefer, which will pop up in a future video in this series. But yeah, she took about 3 years to get really commissioned into the fleet, being fully established in July of 1939. So she kind of missed all the fun early on in China after some brief training. Her first operation would come in 1940 when really her air group more than anything else would support Japanese attack and occupation on Indochina. And then, in early 1941, she would go over to China because it's kind of obligatory and support operations there. And then in April, she would be part of the Butai, where, yeah, the thing. Now, she was the lead ship on and off a little bit of the Second Fleet overall, kind of swapping out with Soryu, and she would go in. They both have little minor refits and updating of the anti-craft guns and some of the systems, and you'll see radars getting installed, yada yada. But they're very, very similar ships, but again, some, because this one does have a little more armor too, especially like at the water line, and again, a very revised island system. So I get it if you want to say that Soryu and Hiryu are separate classes. I also get it if you want to say they're pretty related. Again, all these ships going forward are at least connected to Soryu in a lot of ways. Even though she was really constructed after Japan abrogated the London Treaty, she still kind of shows it with her relatively light construction, high speed, yes, but you know, the nature of it is still there. And again, her very first flight group would have some newer aircraft like the A5M. I don't know if we're quite to the latest torpedo and dive bombers yet when she first is commissioned, but very soon she'll take them on board. We're getting real close to the date. But we still have two other carriers to talk about, including my newest addition. So before we talk about major events sparking and early on in World War II, let's talk about these fellers. Let's call Akagi and Kaga step-sisters, and Soryu and Hiryu as half-sisters. With that said, these two, Shokaku or Shokaku and Zuikaku, are definitely members of the same class and are almost identical, with really one structural exception. And whereas these were built completely with the Washington Treaty in mind and converted, and these were designed under the London Treaty, although mostly commissioned and built afterwards, these were completely free. In fact, they really weren't even in the budget and planned for until the Third Naval Expansion in 1937. And so no restrictions really are apparent here. And in 1941, both of these vessels would be the most advanced aircraft carriers in the world, at least arguably. And they would both launch in 1941 and be commissioned into the fleet. What they wanted with the Shokaku class was the kind of defensive capabilities and armament of Kaga. They wanted the speed of Soryu, Hiryu, and they wanted the flight group and other kind of better characteristics of Akagi. So kind of everything that they'd learned before. And they're able to do it. Clean slate. Although, again, it's still based on the Soryu, Hiryu type design. And it does show. This vessel has kind of everything. It's hard to say. Overall length, it's about 257 meters, so a little under 850 feet long. Beam, it's just a little bit less than Kaga and Akagi at about 95 feet at the flight deck, and so, you know, it's still pretty good. The length of the flight deck is just under 800 feet, so almost as long there. It has very advanced propulsion systems for the day and time, so much so that it's able to hit 34 knots on trials, while still weighing more, around 32,000 tons, give or take, so still a little bit lighter than Kaga and Akagi, but heavier than Hiryu for sure. Flight group, they wanted about the same. Target was 96 aircraft, including the spares. In reality, most of the time they had 80 some odd aircraft, including the spares, with 70 some odd active, so they got pretty close. And they would have the most up-to-date air defense for what it was worth. The 5-inch multi-purpose gun, yeah, you could argue back and forth on that, quite frankly. 120 millimeter. It also had some 25 millimeter guns and whatnot. And mounts were changed. We'd have triple mounts. And actually, this one is Shokaku in 1942. And in that year, so post Pearl Harbor, she would be the first aircraft carrier in the Japanese Navy to be fitted with a radar. This class also had much better armor protection, especially like around the belt for torpedo bulges and all that. Her crew was around 1,650, 1,660. So about the same as the larger carriers. I didn't mention it earlier, but Soryu and Hiryu had a crew of 1,100 something. A little bit smaller there. And she had 2 hangars, although the lower one could only fit fighters. 3 elevators. The front one could actually carry an aircraft with its wings ready to go. The 2 rear were more restricted. But like I said, these were Plan 4 and 37 laid down, and Shokaku here would be commissioned in August of 1941. And there's really only one structural difference between her and her sister, and that is the island. It is on the starboard side of both, but kind of like Hiryu, they originally planned for it to be on the port side. It never was there, but there's a little bit of a bulge in the hull there where it could have once been. But since Zuikaku here over here was a little bit behind, although not by much, it does not have any remnants of the port side island area. And on the spinny thing, Zuikaku, the final one I got, the one that actually just came in today that kind of completes the fleet, and dated 1941. Shokaku would actually be commissioned in August, and she would follow just over a month later in September. And they would immediately begin training for a certain operation to happen that December. So they would be fitted out pretty much from the beginning with their air group that was modernized, featuring the A6M, the Mitsubishi Zero. They would have 18 of those plus a couple of reserves. And they would have the D3A, the Val dive bomber, and they would have the B5N2, the Kate, the torpedo bomber. They would have 27 each of those plus 5 in reserve, giving it a strength of 84 planes, 72 of which were ready to go. But obviously there's not a lot of time to train, not even quite 3 months for Zuikaku, and even Shokaku is not better. That's not even much time for a shakedown cruise, frankly, but they are available, and they do have the newest planes. They're fast, they have better armor, they have the most up-to-date air defense. So they're going to be part of the fleet, making up the 6 carriers that will be used in December 1941. And of course, into 1942. Now, let's talk about the roles, the positions, the assignments of each of the 6 fleet carriers used on December 7, Pearl Harbor. And I think it's really cool that Eaglemoss did different eras of ships. And while it's fine for Soryu to kind of be slightly older than Hiryu and the 38 guys. The really difference is just the air group on her deck. Kaga, even though it's one of my favorites with the kind of cake topper, let's set it aside and just kind of pretend like the Agostini version of Akagi is Kaga for this fleet, because it's pretty much the same aside from just not being the right scale. So we'll set her aside and talk about, the order of battle and how things went, even though you know, so we'll do a streamlined, truncated version today. In April 1941, the Japanese Navy would combine their carriers into the Kaiju Butai, which was the first air fleet, the first naval fleet, and the command would be given to Akagi, with Kaga kind of in the support row. And beginning in August, they begin kind of training and fitting out, and this would last through November. They would take on board modern aircraft. Most would have around 18 Zeros, and then 27 B-5Ns and 27 D-3As. So torpedo and dive bombers. They would even take on board about 100 special kind of shallow water torpedoes. And they would begin to mass up on November 22nd. And on November 26th, the group would head out, taking a circuitous route towards, Hawaii. These would really kind of form the backbone, and all of them would launch in waves, and they would pretty much operate in loose pairs, although they would space themselves out enough that if there was a strike, they wouldn't lose everything. And they would have combat air patrols, but maybe not sufficient. Either way, Akagi would launch first her B-5Ns in the first wave, and then her D-3As in the second wave, with around half the Zeros supporting. And her and Kaga would target the battleships. Both would hit West Virginia and Oklahoma, also the USS California, the Arizona, the Nevada would get hit by one or the other. The Zeros would often attack ground forces, like at Higgins Field. They would destroy around 20 planes on the ground, and planes from Akagi would actually severely damage, forcing it to crash, a B-17 kind of coming in from the mainland. So it kind of gives you an idea. These core ships in the fleet would target the primary targets. Being the newest kids on the block, Shokaku and Zuikaku would be given what was considered the most straightforward task to attack land targets, fuel dumps, structures, airfields, parked aircraft, what have you. Therefore, they would actually launch their D-3As first, there are 54 of them in the first wave, supported by roughly a dozen Zeros from the two carriers combined. They're all working together. Then in the second wave, they would launch their B-5Ns, their Kates, again supported by Zeros. Presumably, the Kates would actually be fitted with bombs as opposed to torpedoes, because, it's a multi-purpose aircraft. And they would do quite well, considering their pilots were green. The crews didn't have a lot of experience working with these really new carriers, and even the carriers themselves only had the very, very basic shakedown crews. That said, they would lose one or two D-3As and a couple of Zeros. Overall, though, taking much less of a pounding compared with Kaga. She seems like she kind of took the brunt, losing roughly half a dozen Zeros and 4 or 5 B-5Ns and 6 or so D-3As. And that leaves us with Soryu and Hiryu would work together, and, they have some experience. But they're also technically the smallest and lightest of the 6 carriers, so they actually get a little bit different loadout. They get 21 Zeros and then 18 of the Vals and the Kates each, so just a little bit different shift. And they're actually assigned to attack the 3 U.S. carriers that are supposed to be in the Pacific at the time. That doesn't work, but they do launch their Kates, their B-5Ns at the beginning, And since they can't find their primary target, the carriers, they go to secondary targets, kind of, of opportunity, hitting some of the other battleships, some that had already been hit, some of the support craft, missing some, hitting others. Their Zeros will strafe targets. The second wave would be their D3As, and they would bomb, again, targets of opportunity, including a, frankly, lucky hit on them on the magazine of the USS Arizona, leading to quite the catastrophe. They would also hit Oklahoma and a few others that had already been attacked by other ships there. And they would suffer a handful of losses themselves, but honestly pretty light. As far as I know, Kaga's air group probably suffered the most, but either way, it wasn't a whole lot for them. And, well, history kind of tells you the stories, the stats of the rest. Afterwards, the majority of the Butai would head back for Japan. Although on their way back, they would detach Soryu and Hiryu around December 16 to support operations on Wake Island. The defenders there, the Allied defenders, would actually repulse the first efforts and hold out longer than they expected, so they would go to support them, and since there were not really any air defenses to come back with, they were able just to strafe and dive bomb and support their own ground forces, leading to the surrender on December 22nd, and within a week they would themselves return to sailing for home, or other closer in areas. Kaga, for example, would head straight back, what have you. So pretty well a success. None of the 6 carriers suffered any damage of note, and Allied victories were few and far between. However, Pearl Harbor did show a few thin cracks in the system. This was probably the most advanced and forward-thinking naval operation in 1941. Grouping all your carriers together, but still kind of splitting them off in pairs and then separating them enough, line of sight and beyond visual range type thing. And at the time, especially the Zero, but also the D3A, and even the B5N to a lesser extent, were very advanced naval aircraft. But again, as I said earlier in the video, this is an era of rapid progression. So what was modern one year may not be the next. They also really had issues with their radio communication, something that would plague both sides in the Pacific, but it would seem to really be problematic for the Japanese and something they wouldn't get over throughout the whole war. Another thing, while their strike abilities were quite good, their defensive abilities were not great. Lucky for them, air defenses on board the ships weren't really called upon. But if they had been, they might have seen some of their AA guns less than effective, especially the dual-purpose ones. Also, their combat air patrols were pretty light and ineffective, especially with poor communications. They kind of snowball. As you notice, they're really favoring their torpedo bombers and dive bombers and not so much the Zeros. Just little kind of nuggets for the future there. But, yes, by December 8, they're victorious, and there's no other way to put it. Gee, I wonder how that all ended up going. But no, these are the 6 fleet carriers. The bulk of the force, they actually had around 10 carriers in service at the time, but the others are typically smaller, training and whatnot. They formed Pearl Harbor. And really, as 41 ends and 42 begins, most are sailing back for home waters to resupply, and some need refitting, re-equipping, and then they have a game plan for the war, which will ultimately culminate in Midway, although not all 6 of these will be there. But that's a story for the second video, and that we'll talk about the fates of these and other large-scale carriers produced during the war, like Tejo. And in the third video, we'll kind of talk about the oddballs and the unique ones. That's a story for next time. Hope this naval video was appreciated. Like I said, it's a lot of work putting these in, but I'm happy to do it. And the other part is, again, getting this today. I'm curious what you think. Again, I kind of like this scale. It serves well when you want to get more than one carrier. A 700 scale is great if you just want like a centerpiece for a group, but one thing, money. When these came out, they were 20, 30 bucks, give or take. Interestingly, all but one, the planes were glued on the deck. I believe it was Shokaku. The actual planes came in a little baggie, and you glue them on yourself. I don't know why they did it that way. But anywho, that's what we got for today. I'll try to have the second part ready by tomorrow or the day after. We'll see how things go. But the more you comment and the more you support, share, the more it will encourage me to get it taken care of. And again, I'm not a Japanese apologist, far from it. But I think it's interesting how Eaglemoss did this group. If some company really wants to get into U.S. carriers and battleships of World War II and make them all, that'd be great. But from what I've seen, they kind of get stuck on doing like the Missouri and the New Jersey, the Enterprise, the Lexington, the Saratoga, maybe some of the Essex class, and then that's it. They don't really go deep in like I'd really like to see. For example, I'd like someone to do the USS Ranger. And it's kind of a bit of a secondary ship, but yeah, or maybe the Langley. Anyway, I'm rambling. Appreciate you hanging out today. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Hopefully tomorrow. Next time.